welcome back to another episode of Hand Tool Rescue. Today, for the first time ever on this channel, I am doing something that has essentially no moving parts when it's functioning. So this will be a little bit different than usual, but still the standard process you're used to. I got these locally at an auction for very cheap. I think it was like $5 or $10, even after all the auction fees. And I immediately thought these would be really fun to see if I can get these at least to work. And if I didn't get them to work, it would be nice to put in new guts from a modern earphone and just have it as a cool pair of earphones. So these are made by the C. Brandes company. It's an American company, and the patent for these is fairly early, just about 100 years ago. The main components are fairly simple. It's just an aluminum, machined aluminum housing, bakelite, ear muff things, and then a metal disc, along with the electronics inside, of course. So these were called match tone. They're supposed to be as accurate as a headphone was at the time. And these were in no way for personal use. Personal use headphones were kind of much later on. These were for telephone operators or for the military or for companies, things like that. Not for a personal radio enjoyment, unfortunately. But we're going to make that a realization today. So after taking most of it apart, it's fairly simple, but I did notice the actual patent date on this, and it's March 13th, 1923. And that patent correlates to just the headband patent. The designer of this patented each component separately instead of all together. The electronics are patented, the housing and the way it attaches to the actual band is patented, and then the band itself is patented as well. Here I'm being delicate because these screw terminals are directly attached to the coils inside the headphones with a wire so tiny I have never even thought that something could be so tiny. So I need to be very delicate because if I break that wire, I'll have to rewind these coils around the magnet, and I won't really get probably the sound that I want out of it. And who knows if it would actually work. So I just need to be careful. You can see the little green wire covered in silk. I can't have that detached and ripped off at the base. I can obviously detach it right where it attaches to the terminal, but I just need to be extremely cautious here. These half moon things are the magnets, and then there's the magnet inside each individual coil, and they help secure the metal disc, the kind of sound diaphragm. You can see right there, this wasn't really attached very well to, it wasn't soldered on very well, or it's just deteriorated over time, or even just my little bit of movement kind of detached it from where it needed to be, because it's probably been work hardened over the last 100 years. So those will need to be repaired, both terminals on this ear and I believe one terminal on the other ear as well. I'm just trying to see if these come apart. I don't know how they're really attached other than maybe they're glued. I just am very cautious with old electronics. Already modern electronics is enough to deal with. So older stuff where there's not a lot of literature is even more complicated if you don't know what you're doing. Here's the other terminal. You can see the terminal's gone on this one, and it's still attached on one ear or one side of the coils, so that is very helpful. Once again, the only thing stopping these whole things from going live is just a little bit of plastic. Not that it's a major electrical current anyways. I believe most of the plastic is bakelite, which is the first type of plastic, first synthetic plastic ever mass produced. So it's probably what we're seeing here. This fabric, I guess the headband was covered in a layer of dirt, and that's what I'm scraping off, like this oily mud. It was really odd, and once that was done, I could actually see the kind of nice two lines down the middle of stitching, which made me happy because it looks better. I could have, I guess, found a new piece of fabric and slid that on, but I don't know. The original style seemed to be fine, and it wasn't way too far gone that needed anything crazy done to it. I'm just sanding kind of any high points very lightly, and then I'll throw these in the deburring machine to give a nice stonewashed look. I'm really liking how it turns out. It highlights kind of the original castings or machining without being crazy polished that, again, tiny scratch and it's ruined. And I also just protect the threads with some heavy tape, just in case. These were very confusing. So these are the diaphragms that actually vibrate up and down to make the sound, but I had a hard time trying to figure out what this coating was because it just does not react to paint stripper whatsoever. Completely impervious. So it could be Japanning, although that would be... It would be fitting, but odd, I feel like, especially only on one side. So it's probably a type of Bakelite, again, basically a layer of very early plastic. So it just needed abrasion to get off. That was the only thing that would work. I set it off, and then I used like Plastidip, something rubbery and thicker, trying to match the sound that it would have had. It was kind of difficult to compare, but I did end up comparing with another set, and it did sound very similar, so I'm happy with that result. These are the disgusting earwax, potentially filled ear covers. I don't even know what to call these. But the process here was just basically get the gunk off, then go up the grits all the way to 2000, and then buff the rest of it out to a nice shine. And usually this works for essentially any plastic, but Bakelite's very, very hard, and it's probably easier to polish than some other softer plastics, like modern plastics. And you could see how they turned out nice and shining, gorgeous. I'm very happy with those. What I'm not happy with is all the nickel plating on the brass. I understand the chromed nickel-y look was very popular at the time, since brass was already all over the place. So having something different was interesting, but I hate it, and I like the brass more than I like the nickel look, so I stripped all the nickel plating off. It was mostly gone anyway, so it wasn't the end of the world. The only thing that was difficult was sanding the little tiny nuts that went on the terminals. Those were also nickel-plated brass, so I just had to do each one by hand, all 6 sides, very slowly. It's just what you gotta do. You gotta do the job properly. There was light rust on some of the internal electronics / any other internal parts, so I just hit it very lightly with a wire wheel, just to knock that rust off. It didn't need to go for a bath or anything. It was just light enough to be fine. So no need to go crazy with over cleaning any of this. I don't want to damage anything either. Here I'm starting the process of recreating the wires that will connect to each of the terminals on each ear, and then eventually into a modern headphone jack, instead of the 2 pins that it would usually end in, and those 2 pins would just slide into like a telephone operator's amp, and then they can get to work. So I needed to work with modern 3.5 millimeter headphone jacks, so I need to do a little bit of modification, but the ends here with the ring terminals are pretty much the same as what was there previously. Although originally they had the spade terminals, the ones that look like a peace sign or a fork. I just thought, completing the ring will make them less of a chance of just ripping out and falling off. So I attached these. I had the original cloth. I have a bunch of feet of this type of cloth wire. And now I'm just going to solder on these ring terminals just in case, because I don't really trust any of the press on, press fit terminal. I don't know. It's too risky. It stresses me out. Once the solder got nice and deep in there, I can just let it flow and then repeat this step for the other side of the ear and then the other ear entirely. So there's 4 ends that I need to do in order to complete it. And these are mono headphones, not stereo headphones. So there isn't a left and a right ear. It's just all the same. But there's so many wires coming off of the ear that all need to end into 2. So basically 4 wires need to end in 2 wires. It makes this kind of soldering attempt much more tricky, and trying to get this all to fit in the headphone jack casing was a little bit difficult as well. I could have spliced them together before they entered the casing of the headphone jack, but there seemed to be enough room there that I could just pull it off, and that's what I'm hoping to do here. All of basically one wire from each ear are connected, and then so all the blacks are connected, all the whites are connected, and then that should allow for the mono sound to be produced and transferred to the ears. We will see how it works, but that's the theory on my wiring here. You can make them stereo by just wiring them up a little bit differently and having a different headphone jack, but it's not really necessary because these are, amazing sounding headphones, since the diaphragm is just a sheet of metal. Once I clipped any excess material off, filed any pointy soldering business, I could slide the sleeve on that insulates this whole thing from touching the metal housing here and allowing the electrical connections to flow where they need to. And then that was it. It was a pretty seamless process. I thought it would not go as easily. So I'm glad that connection and hookup works fine. I originally wanted to do it in a smaller headphone jack, but it's just too massive. There's too many wires coming in and out. Here I am recreating the wound ends of the original wire that I will show you in a moment. Right near the terminals, they were wrapped repeatedly in string. Very tiny string too. This probably took 500 turns to fully cover the area that I needed to. And I don't know if that was for looks or if it was fraying and someone modified it, but it seems to be on other photos of this similar product. So I just went and continued that look for about an inch after the terminal. And you could see the original right there. This needed to be done on all 4, so I just took the time to do that. And I got a little browny bronze string to kind of match the color that was on the previous original wire. Here I am attempting to solder the microscopic wire that hopefully you can see here onto the terminal. There's already a little bit of solder that was on it, but this was not very easy, considering that my soldering iron tip is massive. I need a much smaller one to be able to do this properly, because the connection keeps falling off because it keeps sticking to the massive soldering iron tip. But once you get the solder melted, it's fine. This doesn't need anything crazy since that wire is so tiny. And I just repeated this for the rest of the terminals that needed connections. Um, it's it's making me realize that I need a full set of soldering irons, from heavy duty to more tiny, or just one that has different tips. I guess would be ideal. Maybe I should go and find a set like that. These are the pieces after the stonewashing. I think they look fantastic. Polished would have been nice too, probably. I like the stonewash just because I know these were not at all polished to an insane level, and polishing things stresses me out in terms of one little tiny scratch ruining my whole life. Not into that. So originally, you can kind of see here, I bought these screws, or sorry, these nuts, solid brass nuts, and they were just too big, and I don't know, I didn't like them, so I ended up using the original nuts that I hand sanded and put those back on, just to have everything, the way it should be, I guess. Other than that, the assembly process is very simple. There's very few parts here. And anywhere there was a nickel-plated brass scenario, I address that to my liking. Maybe not to everyone else's liking, but you can't beat the look of brass and other metals. The contrast is just awesome. There's one ear completely done, and there's the other ear completely done. I actually took the time to direct the screws on either side in opposite directions. You can kind of see that the two lined up brass screws. I lined them up in different areas and directions so I could determine which one was left and right when I'm wiring. Even though it's mono, it's just something to do. The ear muff black parts, just easy screw on. Same with the terminals. It's all just screwed together very simply. You don't want to go too hard on screwing these terminals because I don't want to spin the terminal itself behind and inside the aluminum housing. That's, I think, one of the design flaws about this, and I'm sure they addressed it in later versions. I would love to see some later versions of this, but if you tighten the screws on the terminals too much, you'll turn the actual terminal and rip the wire off the coils inside. Not ideal. Not ideal at all. And here, I was just showing off that these are actually copper rivets and pins on here. They just went with a whole crazy assortment of metals. I thought it was just copper plating over steel, but it's actually just solid copper. You gotta love that. You don't see that anymore. The height adjuster nut, I also stripped, but I left the portion that had the patent date on it. That was nickel-plated brass, but I just left it because the contrast there I thought would be interesting. It's not massively noticeable anyways. But I think it looks cool, and it kind of matches the rest of the actual headband, which is what I'm more concerned about. And that's pretty much it. It is technically all done. Now we must test it to make sure I actually wired it up correctly. I had to get an amp because these headphones are, depending on what year, they're like 72 ohms or 2000 ohms. It was hard to figure out what I needed. This amp can't even get to that level, but without the amp, these would be incredibly soft and you wouldn't be able to hear anything. It'd be a very quiet sound. But you can just barely hear them working. My microphone's picking them up, and I'll bring it closer for you guys to hear. So they actually sounded much, much better than I expected. I thought these would be very metallic and tinny sounding. They did still sound kind of old-timey, if that means anything. But I am so happy they work, and I wore these for 2 hours during the Fits All podcast episode, and they are not comfortable at all. So it's something fun to see and have and use, but it's not something you can use every day of your life. Unless you're a hipster, and that's your thing. Regardless, thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you all in the next one.